Hello, chess friends, and welcome to Azadov's Chess Channel, and welcome to the round 7 of the Magnus Carlsen Invitational Tournament in 2020. It's again Maxime Vachier Lagvrave against Magnus Carlsen in their second game of this match game, and now it's Maxime Vachier Lagvrave that's playing with the white pieces. He opened with the move d4, and Magnus responded with the move knight to f6. It was, after c4, a King's Indian game, and I expected really a dynamic game after h4. Really, Maxime plays really these dynamic openings, but Magnus plays the natural move, bishop to g7. Some ideas to play h5 immediately is, of course, very dangerous after knight takes h5, rook takes h5, g takes h5. It seems that the pawn structure is weakened a little bit in front of Black's king, but still there is one problem for White here. Black doesn't need to castle into White's attack, so Black is basically continuing the game. This sacrifice would work if, of course, Black castles immediately. After d6, Magnus delays the situation a little bit in the center, and now Maxime plays a move e4, which isn't, I think, the most aggressive of ways. You could even try to play bishop to g5 or this f3 g4 ideas immediately, not to again place a pawn in the center, because you have already your pawn center control. It's not so important now maybe to bring this e4. It's still common theory, of course, but Magnus now finally castled here after move bishop to e2, now maybe preparing to move h5. One of the main strategical ideas when your opponent attacks you on the flanks is, of course, the counterattack in the center. That's really one of the rules you should know in chess, and it's, of course, the move e5. So Maxime plays maybe here not maybe the most dynamic of choices. d5, I think, is really dynamic with potential f3, g4, knight to h3, knight to f2 ideas. But he really plays now static game after d takes e5. This move really surprised me a little bit. After d takes e5, we have a trade of queens, and now a flank attack basically without the queens with the queens off the board is really not so powerful anymore. Now basically this pawn could be also a weakness, so that's why here Maxime tried to advance the pawn, trade off some pieces. G takes h5 doesn't bring you so much, although here you could trade off a light square bishop for the knight. But in this static position, bishops aren't so powerful anymore, I think. This bishop on e2 was anyway blocked out by its pawn on c4. So that's why here after the move here h5, Magnus plays this very important move c6, because one of the ideas for White is here to play bishop to g5 and then knight to d5, creating this very powerful pin also with attacks on c7. And after the move c6, Magnus basically equalized the position, which is, of course, very good for Black. It's not a problem here to proceed. And if we stop a little bit here already in this position, there is one strategical advantage that Black has that White doesn't have. Here you see White would love to bring now the knight on d5, and it's not possible because the c6 pawn is very important as a defensive piece. But on the other hand, Black can still play, for instance, an outpost on d4, so it could create really some dynamic positions, as White has already made progress with his two centralized pawns. So you couldn't attack this potential knight to d4 outpost with some pawn moves, which is a huge, I think, strategical advantage for Black here. In the game, bishop to g5, creating the spin, it's not a problem because this knight to d5 threat doesn't work anymore. Knight to a6 with preparations to shift the knight on c5 and attack the weak e4 pawn, or play knight to c5, knight to e6, and then knight to d4, which is our main goal in this position from Black's perspective. Knight to f3, we have knight to c5. You see Magnus pulls off his very important attack, and here b4, attacking the knight doesn't bring you so much, because now we could play maybe the move knight to d3, which would be dangerous, or our idea knight to e6 with attacks on the bishop. If you take the bishops, you see after bishop to f6, now knight to d4 is really a great positional advantage here for Black. So you see b4 kicking away the knight doesn't bring you so much, so that's why Maxime simply trade off this pawns. We have h takes g6. No checkmate patterns are possible here because the queens, as I mentioned before, are off the board. The attack is a little bit splashed. it's really an equal game, but I would always rather be black here with the main goal, which Magnus proceeded after the move rook to h4. Now this idea knight to e6, and you see the bishop has to retreat in order to cover this very important d4 square. c5 also by Magnus in order to support this potential outpost doesn't bring you so much, as you always leave again white the opportunity to play an outpost himself. So that's why Magnus proceeded with the move knight to d4. We have knight takes d4, e takes d4, and we have already a simplified line, which is good for black. After queenside castling, we have really simplifications. It's not a possibility to take, of course, the bishop on e3 as your rook is hanging. A better choice, maybe Magnus played here the move knight to g4, very tricky move, but c5, I think now in this position is a possibility, as now really the pieces are hanging. We could go with our rooks, but Magnus tried a tactical move, knight to g4, sacrificing the knight, but it's already a temporarily sacrifice after bishop takes g, bishop takes g, rook takes g4. We have now the opportunity finally to take this bishop because the rooks are connected, and now we have f takes e3, which is a simplification line again for black. Black is down a pawn, but Magnus plays a very nice positional trades of pieces. Bishop takes c3, b takes c3, and it's basically an equalish game. There is also a tricky thing in rook endings that basically double pawns are not so bad. You'll see in the continuation that double pawns basically are not such a weakness, I think, in rook endings. You see how Maxime Vachier Lagvrave of course has really this weak pawns, but it's really hard to attack them. In the game rook takes d1 played by Magnus, king takes d, and now rook to e8 attacking, but now not a problem. King to c2, we have rook to e5, very important move by Magnus to restrict this rook's ability to come into the game, or maybe the king's ability to somehow sneak into the position, maybe through the square c5. So rook to e5, perfect defensive move. Rook to f4, and it's basically a drawish game. If anyone makes really a huge blunder, then of course it's winning for the other for this other player. But now after king to rook to f5 attacking, not a problem. Here king to b3, we have king to f8, and now rook to h4, king to g7, preventing, for instance, Maxime Vachier Lagrave's idea was of course to go with this rook behind this pawn, so that's why king to g7, very important move. Rook to f4, we have rook to g5, rook to f2, and basically this is really a drawish position, as black can never attack these weaknesses. You could go maybe after this pawn, but it's not a problem. Even if Magnus grabs a pawn, still we have the same pawn count on the board. So Magnus tried king to f8, including his king somehow in the attack. The idea is to go with our king to on a very active square on e5. That's why Maxime realized this potential king's activity, possible play, and now after king to e7, king to d3. Here you see how basically these four pawns are protecting the king, so the king cannot be attacked. So that's what I meant, how sometimes these double pawns are really not a weakness in the position in these rook endings. After king to d4, we have king to e6, not a problem, king to d3, and now f6, rook to d2, we have rook to a5, rook to f2, not a problem. Here Maxime simply stayed on the second rank, where basically his main weaknesses are these two pawns. But the problem for Magnus is he cannot attack these weaknesses with the king. This rook is restricting the king's ability to play. Rook to a4, we have g4, rook to a5, another problem, rook to h7, g5, even after the move g5, it's really a drawish position. Now no dynamics are in the game. Here rook to f2 was played, and now a6. Very important move for Magnus now to maybe find some kind of a path here on the queen side. But still, although these are double pawns, still if you move one pawn here, then we can undouble our pawn or even move forward with the move c5. So that's why rook to h7, h2 with preparations to go rook to h7 behind again these pawns, which is the so-called Tarrasch rule in chess. We want to place our rook behind our enemy's pawns. Very important idea now for Maxime to play some kind of counterplay. Rook to a4, not a problem, rook to h7. We have b5 and now c5, restricting this king's ability to come into the game through dark squares. Very important move. Although it seems that you lost the pawn, but it gives now the opportunity for Maxime also to go behind this pawn. Rook takes c, rook takes a6, and again it's a further simplification. King to d6, we have a4, simply trading off pawns, and now c4, advancing the pawn. We can of course take whenever we like this pawn on a4. We have rook to e5, king to d4, and now rook takes a3, and now c5 by Magnus, but still king to d3. The problem is that you still cannot include this king in the attack. We have rook to e8, rook to a6, and now rook, king to e5. It's of course an attacking move against this e4 pawn, but again you're leaving your defense of the c5 pawn in the game. Rook to d8, king to e2, now rook to h8, trying to get some dangerous checks on the second and third rank. Maxime simply took. We have king takes e4, rook to f5, attacking his f7 weakness. Rook to h2, another problem. Rook to f2, covering. Rook to h3, attacking now this pawn. And Maxime simply goes out of the possible check. We have rook takes e3, rook takes f6, not a problem here. Rook to g3. In the game, Maxime simply proceeded with the move c5, rook takes g4, c6. It's of course a drawish ending, as Magnus has this attack on the pawn. Here c7 was played, but now simply rook to c4. Protecting this pawn is not a problem, as we can always cover with the king. So here Maxime tried rook to g6. Magnus simply took the pawn, and Maxime also took the pawn, and in this position both of these players of course agreed to a draw. Okay, it was maybe a special game, but maybe Maxime surprised a little bit Magnus with his opening. Magnus found this very nice simplification line with black pieces. It's of course perfectly fine. We'll see what will happen in the continuation of the tournament. Meanwhile, you can watch my other commented chess games so far from this tournament, and you can also watch my best chess games of all time, with some best chess games that have been ever played in chess history. See you soon with some more videos, and chess is the best, of course.